Hi, welcome to the Korea Foundation, Singapore International Foundation, Virtual Dialogue on Public-Private Partnership in the Fight Against COVID-19. My name is Eric Mobrand. I teach in the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. Today, I'm speaking to you from Singapore, where I'm a visiting scholar in the law faculty at the National University of Singapore. This is the fifth Korea Foundation Virtual Dialogue that has been happening over the past few weeks. Previous installments of this series involved collaboration dialogue with colleagues in Switzerland, Russia, the United States, and Indonesia. There will be a sixth dialogue with Sweden coming up. I'll say more about that at the end of today's event. This event is co-hosted by the Singapore International Foundation, which promotes exchange between Singapore and its neighboring countries and other parts of the world in the spirit of cosmopolitanism. And of course, the Korea Foundation promotes understanding between Korea and other countries around the world in various forms. Our topic today, again, is public-private partnerships in the fight against COVID-19, something that's a part of all of our lives now for the past several months, unfortunately. There are a number of specific questions that fall under this field of public-private partnerships. What role does business play in dealing with the pandemic? How does business work with government? Or put it another way, how does government work with business? What are the ways that governments can induce or entice members of the private sector to collaborate or even take a lead in fighting the pandemic? And I imagine that there are a variety of mechanisms that can be used. In addition, and this we'll hear quite a lot about today from our speakers, what history or learning process led us to particular forms of public-private partnership in the countries that we're looking at? This is to say that the responses from the private sector that we've seen in Singapore and South Korea were not born overnight. They did not appear as soon as the crisis appeared. This is a major theme, I believe, in today's presentations. Rather, they have a longer history because governments, business leaders, other members of the community in these two countries have prior experiences, and they learned from those prior experiences and built something that led to the responses that we've had over the past few months. So I think these are a good set of questions for trying to understand what's happened in these two countries, but also for building lessons that go well beyond these countries. When we think about how Korea and Singapore have experienced and managed the COVID-19 crisis, there are some notable similarities. The main one being the success in keeping the death rate very low. In these countries, in part because of solid responses, in part maybe for other reasons, we've been fortunate to see very low death tolls compared to many other countries. So we haven't had quite the tragedy that other parts of the world have experienced, even though Singapore and South Korea came to this crisis very early. At the same time, there are many very different experiences, both in terms of how the virus came to these two places and the responses that we got to it. So I think we can also reflect on the diversity of experience that we have when we consider these two countries. Those of you in the audience who are interested in other parts of the world, I hope that you are thinking about questions such as, what can we learn from the experiences of Singapore and South Korea, both from what worked well and perhaps what worked less well. And there's also a question of what happens next. Of course, this crisis is not over. There are questions about how do we go back to keeping schools open regularly. In Singapore, how do we get workplaces open and keep them open? So there are many questions that are relevant for the present and near and intermediate future for these parts of the world and others. So I think it's quite exciting to reflect on the experiences of these two countries. Now, today we are fortunate to have with us four panelists who are eminently qualified to reflect on these questions and on these two contexts. So let me briefly introduce each of our panelists in the order in which they will be speaking today. First, we have Professor Gwon-Soon Man, who's Professor of Public Health at Seoul National University and has lots of experience in the specific area of today's forum. Then we have Professor Teo Yik-ying, Dean of the Saw Seahawk School of Public Health at the National University of Singapore. Then we have Director Lee Tae-jung, who is with the Development Finance Division at the Ministry of Economy and Finance in the Republic of Korea. And then we have Dr. Leong Hui Nam, an infectious disease physician, a prominent infectious disease physician here in Singapore. So we have a great lineup for talking about this particular issue, and I look forward not only to the presentations from each of our speakers, but also to the interaction that I hope we can get out of this session. Now, we have an audience viewing this on YouTube, and audience members are encouraged and welcome to submit comments to us there, and I will be checking the comments and questions there, and I hope to be bringing you some questions from our YouTube feed after the presentations. Okay, so here is the order of business. Each presenter will have 10 minutes to speak. Please keep to your allotted time. There is a lot of material, a lot we can talk about, but try to keep your presentation sharp, short, and to the point. And we will try to get back to you in the dialogue and question and answer sessions. So let me first hand the floor over to Professor Guan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this meeting and giving me the opportunity to share the Korean experience with you. Well, I'm an economist by training, although I've been teaching at the School of Public Health for more than 20 years so far. And also I worked at the Asian Development Bank briefly. Okay, this is a snapshot of the COVID situation in Korea. We had a kind of surge of confirmed cases in late February and early March. But since late March, the number of new cases are kind of very stable. And also the number of, the mortality is relatively low, but mainly because, why the mortality is a bit low in Korea? Because the population or age structure of the confirmed cases. In other words, during in mid-February, we had a major infection found at the Shincheonji, so-called Shincheonji Church in Daegu Gyeongbuk area, and then we had a massive testing. And as a result, there's a huge number of confirmed cases from younger population. So because Korea is a relatively more younger confirmed cases, as a result, we seem to have a bit lower average mortality rate. So this is the comparison of confirmed cases of Korea and other countries, especially the OECD countries like US, Italy, Germany, and the UK. Korea, as I mentioned earlier, from starting mid-March, that we have a very stable, total number of confirmed cases, whereas the US, Italy, and Germany, there was kind of a surge of confirmed cases. Then, what is the major characteristics of this Korea's response to COVID-19? I would say it's a two component. One is a preparedness, and the second component is a flexibility. Okay? Then why? And also for this preparedness perspective, Korea's policy learning from the MERS in 2015 is a major kind of contributing factor, I would say, because at that time this Middle East respiratory syndrome, Korea, unfortunately, we feel it's a shame that we had the largest amount of mortality from MERS outside of the Middle East region. So after that, the experience about 5 years ago, Korean government strengthened the Korean Centers for Disease Control, and we changed the law of communicable disease control. And after this revision of law, we formally adopted the policy of very aggressive tracing of contacts. And this contact tracing is based on the interview and also credit card use and mobile phone location and the collection of information from all CCTVs. And also, this law made it possible for the effective coordination of central and the local government. As you know, the majority of the communicable disease control is at the hands of local government. But for this type of COVID or major, very serious outbreak of infectious disease, the coordination between central and local government is very important. And after MERS, we adopted this policy of coordination. And also we realized the importance of testing after MERS. So because of this preparedness, we are able to flatten the epidemiological curve and successfully reduce the number of infectious cases. Because if we failed in this first round of control or flattening of the epidemiological curve, we cannot avoid the overburdening of the healthcare system. So, but luckily in Korea, we are able to flatten the curve and avoid the overburden on the healthcare system. Rapid response Korea consists of like a testing and tracing and isolation and treatment. When we had a first case, confirmed case found at the end of January, but even at that time, the Korean CDC had a meeting with producers of test kits, and after that, the government provided a very swift, rapid approval for the test kits. And so we are able to implement a mass-scale testing, and also there's some local-level innovations like drive-through and outdoor walk-through, and this type of innovations made possible for the rapid testing, but also we are able to avoid the potential infections. So, especially for COVID-19, as you know, there are a lot of cases of asymptomatic patients. So those who do not have symptoms, but they can still infect others. So early detection and isolation of that type of asymptomatic patient was made possible thanks to the rapid and mass-scale testing. And as a result, Korea successfully so far contained the outbreak with the very minimum restrictions, and there's no lockdown so far. So this is the test cases. So as you can see, in the case of Korea, starting in February, there's a huge increase in the number of tests. Germany also followed a similar case, but this is a mass-scale testing is very prominent in the case of Korea. But preparedness is not enough. We need a flexibility because COVID-19 is a new disease. So we should be ready to adjust to the new new evidence, and we should be ready to learn from trial and errors. So at the beginning, after the mass testing, we had a large number of patients, and then all of the patients were hospitalized. And then we realized that we have a shortage of hospital beds. So we introduced a patient triage system, such that only the severe patients are hospitalized, and milder cases were sent to the so-called residential treatment centers. These treatment centers are not hospitals, but the former residential buildings of big corporations. They are converted into residential treatment centers, and they are examined by health personnel. So this type of policy innovation also contributed to the successful response. Governance, I think transparency in communication is very important because when people trust the government, trust the Korean Center for Disease Control, people are more willing to participate in the social distancing, personal hygiene, and they voluntarily cancel all those meetings. And it also resulted in the landslide victory of the ruling party in the recent general election. And UHC is also very important because it means a low financial barrier to access. And cost of treatment is free, because I mean the major component of the cost of treatment is covered by national health insurance, but co-payment part is also free, because in case of communicable disease, the government pays the co-payment part, and cost of testing is also covered by these UHC schemes. In terms of PPP, it's quite important, because the majority of hospitals, like I would say, more than 90% of the hospitals in Korea are private hospitals. So the majority of the testing was performed in private sector, but also treatment of patients. Still, I think the majority of the patients were treated in the public hospitals. But Korean National Health Insurance Law mandate all providers, like public and private, there's a mandate for them to join the healthcare system. So although private providers were not happy with this strong mandate, but because of this mandate, private hospitals, even if they don't want, but they should join the treatment of the COVID patients. So this is PPP as a component of both kind of financial incentive, but at the same time legal mandate for the private providers to join the system. So this is the diagnostic capacity in Korea. As you can see, the majority of the clinical labs are in the private sector. And in terms of service delivery, with the government introduced a separate path, because this COVID patient has a potential to infect others. So they designated a given number of hospitals around the country. And in those hospitals, they have a separate paths for respiratory symptom respiratory patients. And then also government temporarily allow a telemedicine, which means a prescription without visit, and prescription is made possible by a phone call. And as I mentioned, the allocation of milder patients to the residential treatment centers. But still, Korea also, I mean, although we had some good and some successful responses, we also have some challenges, such as like a vulnerable population. We had a mass infection in long-term care facilities and geriatric hospitals. So still, because of this, the mortality for all the population is very high. And although the workers in the formal large corporations, they were able to work from home, but still the vulnerable workers or workers in the small industry, poor daily workers, they couldn't work from home. And also they lost jobs a lot. And also the school issues, we learned a lot from the Singapore experience of school closure and opening. But I think we have been closing the school, and internet-based classes was open for so long, such that we are worried. I am worried as a person in policy. I'm worried that this type of no schools or internet-based classes might have a negative impact on the students, especially from a poor household. And also, we know the PPP is very important, but still, private hospitals are reluctant to aggressively participate in the treatment of COVID-19 patients. So, about 80% or slightly more than 80% of the COVID-19 patients are treated in the public hospitals. Okay? So, still, although PPP is important, but I still think the public hospitals' role is still very important. And it's exit strategy, because I mean, when should we ease these restrictions and to what sequence? So we need, it seems that we need some differentiated measures instead of a uniform restrictive measures for all sectors. So we should have some kind of risk assessment, such that for those population or for those places with a higher risk, we may have to introduce a more aggressive restrictive measures. I think that's it. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks very much, Professor Guan, for that insightful presentation on the experience in Korea. Very good. And then let's move directly on to Professor Teo.
Right. Right. Thanks very much, Professor Mobran. We are trying to sort out the sound, and finally it worked. So I'm really... Right, I'm really pleased. Okay, stay, right. We don't need to mute or unmute anymore. Right, I'm really pleased to be invited to this joint webinar between the Korean Foundation and the Singapore International Foundation. And I'm very glad that I'm speaking after Professor Kwon, because what he has shared earlier on in terms of universal health coverage, in terms of the very aggressive contact tracing, testing strategy that Korea has adopted are very much reflected in Singapore's experience as well. So I will spend about 7 to 8 minutes talking about what we did in Singapore, and together with my colleague, Dr. Leong, we would perhaps share with you what Singapore has done around this space of public-private partnership. Now, what we have heard earlier on about the Korean experience, Singapore, we had our due share of learning and fine-tuning our response from SARS. SARS affected Singapore back in 2003, and we were regrettably one of the countries in the world that was affected quite significantly by SARS. But because of that, we had the opportunity to really understand what are the gaps in the current healthcare system and in the general public health system in Singapore that we need to start addressing some of these gaps. So after SARS, there was a lot of review happening within Singapore, and we had a second dry run with H1N1 in 2009. So in terms of the situation with COVID-19 at the moment, Singapore, we have about 38,000 infections in Singapore. Right now, there are slightly less than 13,000 that are actively still infected at the moment. But if you notice, we have very low numbers of people in intensive care units and even in the general hospital wards. Less than 300 people in the hospital despite having 13,000 infections. And this is very similar to what Professor Kwon has mentioned, that we learn early on what are the characteristics of a COVID-19 infection, where the vast majority, up to 80% of the people infected, they are actually suffering from very mild infections that can be treated in a step-down care facility. And this is where we isolate the infected with mild symptoms in what we call community isolation facilities, very similar to what Professor Kwon said about residential treatment centers in Korea. So these are government facilities. They are not sent back home. I emphasize that everyone who is infected and confirmed with a PCR test to be positively infected, they are always managed within a government facility. They are not sent back home to be isolated at home. And I see this as a significant difference in terms of general community spread, in terms of keeping your fatality or your complication rates down. And Singapore, very much like South Korea, we were very fortunate and very privileged to say that our fatality rates, despite having almost 39,000 infections, stands at about 25 people in Singapore. Now, what we have in Singapore, you would notice, actually we have two fronts that we are fighting this infection at. One is what's happening in the general community, and then the second is actually what's happening amongst the foreign migrant workers that stays in dormitories. And you would see that very early on, Singapore, we saw our infections happen in two waves. The first wave happened in January from importations, and the second wave was actually in the middle of March, also following importations. And you could see the yellow curves, the community cases. The real peak happened about 2 to 3 weeks after the peak of the importations. So we know what's happening in Singapore in the community was driven very largely by what's happening from infections that were spread by people returning to Singapore. Returning Singaporeans back in March, they were interacting with their family, and unfortunately some of this went out and spread the infection to people outside. That was what happened in the community, but regrettably, some of the infections in the community affected foreign migrant workers, and they bring it back to their dormitories. And this is when an infection as transmissible as COVID-19 enter an environment where there were a significant human density, people were living quite close together, the household units that we're used to for COVID-19 now becomes the dormitories. And that's when the spread happened very quickly. And that was why Singapore, we had our two different fronts that we need to manage. One is in the community, and one is in the migrant workers living in dormitories. The principles that Singapore adopted, 3 key principles that I will talk about, again, very similar to what Professor Kwan mentioned. I think these are very good public health principles that was advocated repeatedly by the World Health Organization. What is this? The first is really around active case finding. Find where your cases are, and you can do that by aggressively testing, by aggressively and comprehensively performing the contact tracing. Every person that was identified to be a confirmed case, we trace 14 days of that person's movement history, interaction history, where they have been to, which taxi they got on. We use CCTV footages, very similar to the comprehensiveness that Korea adopted. We test as much as possible, and right now we are exceeding 8,000 tests per day with the intention of heading towards 40,000 tests per day in July, in about 3 weeks' time. And we see the impact of these aggressive approaches because back in early February, it takes on average about 10 to 15 days for us to find out who are the people who have been infected and to isolate them. 15 to 18 days to isolate someone who has been infected, that is a very long time. But right now, you could see that this number of days have reduced quite significantly to around 3 to 5 days. And that means that the contact tracing and the isolation is happening very quickly to minimize any community transmission. The second key principle is really the reliance on evidence. And this is where one of the partnership comes in, because the government, in deciding their policies, partnered with academics, partnered with scientists, private scientists and public scientists in universities to really understand what are the impact of different measures that will be taken. For example, should we close schools? And we saw that actually closing schools based on what we knew back in February, back in March, will have very little impact to the spread of COVID-19. What about closures of workplaces? What about other closures of transportation network? Many of these decisions were made by actively considering the evidence from models, from what we know about the transmission dynamics. At the same time, when the world was struggling to understand about COVID-19, there were scientists, there were modelers that were generating evidence and data from different parts of the world, including South Korea, including China. And we have a system within Singapore to understand this information, to produce briefs, policy briefs weekly that are shared with the policymakers. So back when people were struggling to understand what to do, at least the Singapore government had a systematic way of understanding the latest literature and science on various topics, including diagnostic, therapeutic, and right now even vaccine. The link that I have shared on the webpage is an active link. All the documents, all the information are updated weekly. You are very much welcome to access some of this information to find out what are the latest in terms of, for example, exit strategies that different parts of the world are adopting. And finally, I talk about our lessons learned from SARS. And this is again where we learned about the transmission dynamics of COVID-19. We put mild patients in isolation facilities, preserving our precious hospital resources for the severe and for the high-risk groups. And those are strategies that help. One of the key reasons that help to reduce the severity rates and the fatality rates. Post-SARS, we learned that we need to have a national center for infectious diseases. And we were very fortunate that we did have a national center that was inaugurated August or September last year. So it was very much in time for COVID-19. And the third principle, again, Professor Kwan highlighted and emphasized the importance, clear communication to the public in terms of what is the situation, What should the public do? And what are the new rules? Because we see worldwide that rules keep changing with an evolving situation, and the public needs to know what are the latest rules. And in terms of partnership, this is a Singapore healthcare system map. And you would see that the majority of our primary care sector, the general practitioners, they are actually private practitioners. They are private GPs. And this is where the government worked very closely with the private GP to set up what we call public health preparedness clinics. And the public health preparedness clinics typically will be the first line of defense for any infectious disease, because when I have a respiratory infection, when I'm coughing and I'm sneezing, I go see the GP. I don't go straight to the hospital. And that is where this partnership with the private GP became fundamental to Singapore's fight against COVID-19. And Dr. Leong himself, a private practitioner, he will share this experience later on as well. And the last I want to talk about is really around global health partnership, because we have seen that countries unilaterally conducted a lockdown of their respective countries. And when we start to think about easing and exit strategies, countries must coordinate. And when we think about public health responses and strategies, we need to remember that different countries do have different contexts. We have the historical context, Korea, Singapore, we shared our historical context. We were more prepared than many other countries. There are social and cultural contexts. We talk about trust in South Korea, Singapore, equally, East Asian society, huge degree of trust between the people and the policymakers. The capacity and capability in terms of testing, we have been very privileged that through Singapore International Foundation, through some of the universities and private enterprises, Singapore was able to aid some of the fight in Myanmar, in Indonesia, even in South America. But I think there are 2 points that I would like to highlight. Economic ability to contain COVID-19. We talk about the universal health coverage, making sure that treatment, testing regimes are made affordable or even free for people, so they come forward to be tested on their own. And finally, the political context. This is an area that governments need to invest with a long-term outlook. And for investment in public health with a long-term delivery, you need a government that is very self-assured and very confident. And that's where you could see some of the countries that may have very good expert knowledge in terms of pandemic control and preparedness, they may fall short because their governments perhaps may be struggling to win popularity, and that's where their focus tend to be on short-term impact, that it's less likely to be public health investment. With that, I'll end, and I would like to pass it on back to Professor Mulbrand. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Dean Teo, for that, again, a very equally clear, lucid presentation, hitting on a few key points in private-public partnerships. One of these points relates to research and the role of scientists who are out of the direct orbit of government, and also about communication and links between the state and private general practitioners, as well as the global role, connection between Singapore and the effort abroad to fight this. So some really great, clear points. And I think we already see the contours of a comparison between Singapore and South Korea emerging. All right, now let's hand it over directly to Director Lee, please. Again, from the Ministry of Economy and Finance in South Korea. Director Lee.
Okay. Thank you, Korea Foundation, and also Singapore International Foundation for hosting the virtual dialogue series on the public-private partnership to overcome the challenge posed by the COVID-19. COVID-19 presents an unprecedented problem and trouble which can be solved at the end by the people coming together. High level of cooperation between the government and the citizens are essential for defeating the pandemic. Although the Korea is still reporting the new confirmed patients, but we have successfully flattened the curve, and the collective effort from the central government, municipal government, business, the citizen, and also even the military have played a very pivotal role in this endeavor. Today I'd like to share the two things. First, on how the PPP has been led to containing the COVID-19, and if time allowed it, and I would like to talk about what's the economic measure, and because COVID-19 start with the health quarantine crisis, but it is also indeed the economic crisis all countries are facing right now. First, I'd like to talk about how the PPPs are done in the area in dealing with COVID-19. And I'll first focusing on the business circle. First and foremost, the business sector has been the front line in tackling the COVID-19. In the area of testing, even from the early January, when the Korean government has not found any confirmed cases, the government has disclosed information on the previously developed testing kit and the method, so that the pharmaceutical and the test kit company were able to speed up of developing of the test kit. The week after that, one company developed testing kit and obtained the authorization for the emergency use from the Korean Centers for Disease Control and also the FDA. And the SIF authorization of diagnostic testing through the fast-track process, leading to adequate supply of testing kit. And this is one of the key elements Korea was able to find it, the confirmed case, even at in the verge of outbreak. Next, on the tracing. The COVID-19 epidemiological support team is the official data platform developed by the government to track and analyze the COVID-19 cases. The system runs in close coordination with the 3 telecommunication companies as well as a 22 credit card companies. Using the real-time analysis data such as GPS, mobile information, and transaction history, the system helps quarantine officials confirm the transmission route of patient and detecting the source of transmission. And it used to take 24 hours and longer, but now it was able to shorten within an hour or so to identify where the route, and also to inform the very important information of hotspot to the public. And next, on the treating, the Korean business group, such as well-known Samsung and LG, has voluntarily offered their training facility and even their staff dormitory to be used for the community treatment center for COVID-19. And like the Professor Moon has said, this treatment center was used for the patient with mild symptoms. And for the other measure, and one of the notable measures in Korea in tackling the COVID-19 is using the face mask. And so Korea is a population of 51 million people. And but however, our maximum capacity to produce a face mask is under the 10 million for each day. And we are able to solve it through the publicly distributed mask information service. This is also developed from the public-private approach, which was utilized by the government and developer, and also the private company. And the government released data on the face mask sold on each day. Cloud company provide the cloud map, and also telecommunication provide the maps. So all the people, before they go to the location, they know that which area has stock and which area does not have sold out. So this is another good information that PPP is critical. And next, I would like to talk about the civic role of the civic organization and play in the COVID-19. And first, I cannot mention the importance of hospital and the medical staff. Like we said, most of the hospital in Korea is still run by the private, and they're getting their support. And also the allocating the enough bedding for the COVID-19 patient will be also one of the very important tasks. And we're able to secure their support and assistance. And in area of a quarantine kit, non-profit organization like the Korean Red Cross has provided the quarantine kit, which include the food, water, and necessity for the self-quarantine people. So if once the people has been isolated, they cannot leave their area, and they need to get the, the essential daily need. And we have getting this kind of support not from the government but also from the the Red Cross, have provided enough the necessity to survive, to maintain their quarantine for the 14-day. And finally, I'd like to talk about how the citizen played the role in COVID-19. Voluntary participation from the citizen are essential element in responding the pandemic and epidemic without lockdown pressure. It is critical that the government has successfully gained the trust of citizens by providing the clear, accurate, and real-time information of COVID-19. And this trust and confidence is important because without this, the people will not fully abide by the the guidance, and the government, no matter how competent the measures are, it cannot be effective in dealing with COVID-19. And also, citizens in the self-quarantine has abide the quarantine rule by not going outdoor, and also avoid the contact with their family member during this time. Moreover, the public voluntarily participating in the very high level of social distancing for the first 2 months, and also the high level of personal hygiene requirement. And let me just briefly talk about the economic measure. And the damage to Korean economy has been also the colossal. And today, I think the World Bank has released the latest data on the global economic outlook, and it has been that this is the worst crisis since the Second World War, and its impact is 3 times higher than the 2008 global financial crisis. In April this year, Korea recorded the deficit of a trade deficit for the first time in 99 months, and this is not something new for the country in the Western and also the U.S., but a country like Korea is making the bread and butter by the selling selling goods out in overseas and engaging trade. This is a very important incident. And Korea also led to the more than 470,000 job loss, and which marking one of the largest drop in the past 21 years. So in sum, this is undeniably the economic wartime situation. The measures against economy are still ongoing, but I would like to summarize the various measures in the 3 key words. First is the protecting, second is preserving, and third is preparing. First, we are protecting the vulnerable group and the business and job. The government has begun paying out the emergency relief payment totaling $11.7 billion to all households from the May 11. And government has been providing the liquidity to business and the small and medium side, also the micro, with including the low interest loan to the vulnerable business. Second, we are preserving the economic recovery and also the resilience of economy. Once the dust of the COVID-19 disappear, we have a great challenge to revitalize and reopen and restart the engine of the economy. The government has been providing the industry-specific support for the vulnerable industry, and such like airline, tourism, and also the large manufacturer. And finally, third is we should also prepare for the post-COVID-19 the war. The government is working hard to providing the various measures, and we have announced that we will push for the Korean version of a New Deal, and also preemptive investment for the future, including the new deals on the Digital New Deal and also the Green New Deal. And this measure is being prepared and due to be unveiled in coming months. And finally, COVID-19 is indeed the right time for the government to boost the capacity and capability to track and respond to the crisis, while incentivizing collective action and cooperation. The COVID-19 pandemic underscored the need for the government and citizens to work together more effectively than ever before. And I think this will be another important lesson that we should all share after the COVID-19. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Director Lee, for that comprehensive overview. So Director Lee has touched on a wide range of issues and responses from the South Korean government for us here and laid that out very nicely. Now we'll turn to Dr. Leong from Singapore. Okay, without further ado, Dr. Leong.
I'm so happy that I've been invited to do this. This is a great meeting and we can share different views. And then we realize that despite our differences and our far distances, we have so many things in common. I'm going to share a little bit about COVID-19, about private and public collaboration. Now this discussion will cover a few things about SARS. Korea has MERS, we have SARS, and what I call man defines, virus defies, and how we cope with the surge and how private collaboration helped. And private GPs that came to fight, the PHPC, which Professor Teo talked about. And we have healthcare ambassadors from flight to fight. Our Prime Minister who came forward messaging, and one of the Southeast Asian countries were very supportive of our Prime Minister and commented on his good work. And then we're going to talk about a bit of minion messaging and of course health serve. SARS affected many countries, and then in turn, it has taught us many things. In fact, I felt that SARS was a blessing to Singapore, and so MERS was a blessing to South Korea. And after that, we learned we had to control. If anything, there will be another epidemic after COVID-19. And my sincere hope is that everyone gets prepared for the next epidemic, and very sure it will be traveling much and spreading much faster and wider. After post-SARS 2003, the government came up with protocols for the next epidemic, and every year, all hospitals will go through annual drills because we knew and we suspected SARS would come. There was a stockpile of equipment, which you have to do it in a national effort as well as in their own individual hospitals. And there was a building of NCID, the National Center for Infectious Diseases. To be honest, this was shelved for quite a few years, but when SARS came, there was a sudden need and decision to build this National Center of Infectious Diseases. And very fortuitously, it was built and completed, inaugurated just last year in time, as if God has blessed us. And then we were ready for COVID-19. Companies had to come up with pandemic readiness based on the protocol of SARS. And of course, everyone was mask fitted and PPE taught. Between 2003 and 2020, we have 4 extra hospitals. And with that, we had more than 1,000 beds extra, easily 2,000 to 3,000. Singapore wanted to be ready. But what we planned for, what we defined, the virus completely defied. The virus was easily transmitted, there were asymptomatic transmissions, and masks, which was just prepared for the healthcare workers, they were not enough because every man in the street, every woman in the street wanted a mask. And the foreign workers, they were the perfect transmission model for COVID-19. They shuttled between construction site to dormitory to the rest and recreation into what's called the Mustafa Center. It's a favorite shopping haunt for many foreign workers, and the virus was spread between the 3, bring all the workers to one place and disseminate the virus to everywhere. It makes the perfect model for transmission. Singapore had a huge surge, and this was in part due to the foreign workers in dormitories. There was what the hospitals and what the government had to do was to try to curtail all elective surgeries. This ended emptying the hospital wards and freeing the critical care beds and equipment. The help of 4 additional hospitals certainly helped. There were a few thousand more beds available. And there was an enlistment of private hospitals. Private hospitals received some of the milder cases of patients, so that in turn, the public hospitals could take the sicker patients and attend to them better. There was also a recruitment of private doctors who were relatively freer and available to do other matters. How did Singapore cope further? Like Korea and in China, those off-site community care facilities, they will stratify the individuals by medical risk, and the better patients were sent off to the off-site community care. Community care facilities made use of chalets, which no one goes to now, military camps, and even exhibition centers. Exhibition centers that were planned to house big meetings, they were all empty, and then they converted into living accommodations, which I'll show you. But the government services alone were clearly insufficient. They needed the help of private care. Now, this is a picture to show you what happened in a typical exhibition hall. You see that the barriers were put up, and then there were beds. There were dormitories, and then people could all live in them. And that way, many people with COVID-19 could be looked after by a small number of people. Everyone would have their own blood pressure set, as well as temperature readings, so that they would take their own readings and submit it electronically, making things easier. This is a bird's eye view of yet another center where you have the living accommodations put into a typical exhibition hall. Now, everything gets a welcome pack. Everyone gets a welcome pack. So you actually see some toothbrush, some washing detergent, even a thermometer, as well as hand rubs and a mask. And of course, you have water as well, so you can drink and be a little bit more comfortable. This is another shot of another room, and you can see right on the floor, you will have your charging ports, power and electricity, so people can still be connected through their mobile phones with the rest of the world. Who runs it? Now, not everyone was involved in the direct care of patients. So the dentals, the ENTs, and the general surgeons, they were not so busy. They were asked and repurposed to help look after these patients. Private healthcare doctors, family physicians, they were roped in to help to run these centers, and they would be rostered, and there were a minimal number of people running the show at any one day. There were private medical groups such as the Parkway Shenton and Raffles Medical Group. In complete honesty, the amount of patients in the private care fell, and they freed up people to actually help run these facilities. Now, there's also something called SG Healthcare Corps. SG stands for Singapore. They look at people, and they try to get people who are not working, who have free time, to volunteer time to help look after these individuals, or in areas of need which the government was not meeting. Now, these are just a few pictures taken from the newspaper. You have people who are volunteering from all walks of life. They will provide administrative, logistic support, and of course, they'll be well covered and protected when they serve their responsibilities. Then you can see at the bottom picture on the right, 3,000 healthcare professionals, they volunteered to help fight the coronavirus. So the fight wasn't with Singapore government with COVID, but rather it was a united effort, all healthcare workers coming together. And you will see this SG Healthcare Corps, and they are recruiting healthcare professionals. That's on your left. You could be a nurse, doctor, allied health, pharmacy. They were also looking for non-healthcare professionals. If you could do administrative support or community care, you are desired. You are wanted. And in addition, Professor Teo has highlighted this, PHPC. Now, one of the problems which the hospital suffered was that everyone was going to the hospital for the most minor illness. And what they created then was actually PHPC, Public Health Preparedness Clinic. It took the pressure off the hospital. People who were sick could go down to these clinics. They pay a flat rate of Singapore $5 to $10 or US dollars 3 to 7. They get consulted, and then they get referred in if there were symptoms suggestive of COVID-19. So in other words, people were getting cheap, subsidized care without having to rush to the hospital. Overall, they recruited 949 clinics all throughout the island. Now, there's another thing which I'm extremely proud of. Singapore has Singapore Airlines, and when the planes became grounded, the flight became a fight for them. Singapore Airlines cut capacity on 96%, and the aircrew were repurposed. And this picture shows you that from serving aboard the planes, they have gone on to serving the people. Flying the air became transport ambassadors, guiding people on taking the trains and how to keep themselves safe. Flying the air became caring for patients. They were in the industry of serving people, hospitality, and they did their job beautifully well. These are just Facebook pages which were taken from 4 different hospitals who had air crew, the serving on the ground. And you can see at the poise and the beautifully tied hair, you can tell that they were no ordinary healthcare workers. They were people who were poised to work in the air as stewardess. This is another IA cabin crew. He's used to serve on board the cabin crew, and now he's actually applying the oxygen probe for the patient. This is a lady who used to serve on board the plane, but now guides people on the MRT stations, that means the train stations, and guide people along, maintaining safe distancing at the same time. Not only was there Singapore Airlines, but SATS, which is ground handling and in-flight catering service company, Jetstar, they repurposed their staff. They released their staff so that they can help in the fight. It was the private coming hand in hand with the government to fight COVID. It was literally all hands on deck. This is one of my favorite slides in the entire deck. It shows that healthcare workers were really short-staffed, and the air crew came down to help. And they really bent their back all the way to help all the patients, from feeding to helping them sit up to just putting a hand to comfort them. I am truly proud of these air crew people. The Prime Minister has been tasked to give some messages, and some Southeast Asian nations have commented on how good they were. But the messaging also went through to the minions. The picture on the left is actually Phua Chu Kang. He's a very famous TP personality. YouTube was created, and then they talked about responsibility. And there's also a YouTube person on the right, Nina, and then there were questions and answers for YouTube that were done. At the end of the day, all this was about service from the heart. And I want to introduce you to HealthServe. This is a non-profit organization that helps with providing healing and hope to migrant carers. They've been there for many years, more than 10 years, and they run mobile clinics as well as street clinics island-wide, staffed by volunteer, providing a huge area of services besides medical care, including legal, counseling, social, education, advocacy. This is a picture to show you before COVID-19, how they're helping foreign workers, and they will queue up and pay a flat rate of $8 for consultation, medications, and injections. HealthServe was a service for foreign workers run by volunteers. But when COVID-19 came, there was a restriction on the places which a doctor can practice. So there was a sudden dire needs to continue the service. For 120 doctors, it became 6. And of course, when the going gets tough, the tough gets going, telemedicine came along. Students were helped with blood pressure monitoring, and it was remote consultation with telemedicine. We were still providing medical care from the voluntary groups in Singapore, private driven, for the domestic, our foreign workers. This is a slide given to me by Professor Teo Ying. He's the other speaker in this meeting, and he quoted his colleague, Dr. Jeremy Lim, and says that if we don't look after the migrant workers, we are not looking after the weakest link. We will all pay the price. And indeed, the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. So my salute to Dr. Jeremy Lim, who actually helps out and volunteers and advises HealthServe. Now, there's a lot of outpouring of emotion and support for the foreign workers, which actually formed the bulk of the cases recently. And with that, we actually have YouTubes And there's a recent virtual children's choir singing Diana Ross' song, If We Hold On Together. I'm going to show you the link at the screenshot of the YouTube. You will see a QR code on the top right-hand corner of the slide. Take out your handphone, scan it, and then play it. In fact, if you can scan it, play it, and share it. Every share which you do, donors will be found to donate 5 Singapore dollars to HealthServe, the very voluntary medical clinic that's going to help all the foreign workers there are. This, at the end of the day, this song was to raise funds and bridge the gap between migrant workers. That comes to the end of my slide. It's a little bit of a rush. I'm leaving this to the end so that everyone can take out your phone now, scan this, share it. Help make a donation to HealthServe and help the foreign workers in Singapore. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Leong, for getting through all of that material in an efficient manner and for another very clear presentation. We've had 4 clear presentations that get right to the point, and I'm very happy about that. Before, we have a number of questions from the audience that is following us on YouTube, and I want to get to those as soon as possible. First, though, I'd like to ask the speakers themselves if they have any questions or responses to any of their colleagues. Perhaps I'll start in the order we went in. Professor Guan, would you like to respond or ask a question to any of our other speakers?
No, it's fine. Yep.
No? Okay. Would anybody else like to respond? Dr. Leong.
Hi, actually, I marvel at the Koreans, from the food to the movies and now to the control of the epidemic. And one thing which I found very appropriate was the Koreans had a strong buy-in. All the citizens actually listened to the government and followed all the care. How did the government get the buy-in of all the people and the corporation, including, for the record, I love your just a swab, drive-past swab for the PCR. I thought it's a fabulous invention. So my question is, how did the government get the buy-in of all the people and the corporation? That is amazing work.
Thanks. Professor Guan or Director Lee, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think it's a part of social capital and trust, and also the director of the KCDC, Ms. Jung Eun-kyung, I think she became very trusted, and people see that there's really truth in her message. So, of course, KCDC is only one part, but KCDC and also the government regular briefings, it is very detailed information about how many confirmed cases, how many mortalities, what is the real situation. I think people seem to quite trust the message. And then it's a part of social capital. And I think you already mentioned that East Asian, we sometimes call it Confucian welfare state. So overall, I think people in East Asia seem to be more willing to, I would say, comply or follow those government messages in a case of emergency, I think, yeah.
Okay, if I...
Thanks, Professor Guan. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I had added one thing is, I think I said it very simple in the 5-letter, and that there is a trust between the government and the people. And the word is very, simple, but I think it is not simple to build a bond of trust between the people and the government, especially at the times of crisis. But I think we said it like the 2015 the MERS outbreak was also the good chance to learn. But I think if we go back a little bit farther, 2008 and also 1998 Asian financial crisis, Korean people are I think, unique cultural background that when there is crisis, I think there is a full trust for the government and support and stand behind them. And one example is, I think there is a currency shortage in the 97 Asian financial crisis. And the people tried to get the foreign currency in dollar, and there is no way we could do it. And they voluntarily give up their gold ring. And there is tradition that Korea that for first birthday of the young baby and their families and friends and relatives and present the golden ring to the baby. And this is kept it until they get married and also being separated from their parent. But there is experience that the Korean people willing to give up their gold ring for the sake of the national economy. So I think it's at the time of crisis, people all feel that there is a need we need to work together behind it. And able to go through this crisis, there is an incredible amount of energies building on, and I think this is also the example of a social capital. So at the end, it's a simple word of trust, but it is built over time and continuous basis.
Okay, yeah, thank you for those insights. I'd like to ask one question myself here, and this word crisis has come up several times for good reason. Many of the responses from government and involving the private sector are sort of emergency measures, the responses that have been mentioned in today's discussion. So my question is, to what extent do these same tools work for ordinary times? Eventually, we need to move to some sort of routinization where we have ordinary institutions that are able to cope with the ongoing public health problems we face. Do we have confidence that the success we've seen, to the extent we've seen success in both of these places over the past few months, can continue in ordinary times, or are they kind of specific to a mobilization that occurs during an emergency? I invite any of the speakers to respond. Professor Chiu.
Right. Thanks very much, Professor Mobrand, for that question. And I thought I would address this first because this is actually something that we in Singapore stand for quite strongly on. And it's really around partnerships in public health. Because when governments have to make public health policies, they need to have the right evidence and the right science. And to many extent, governmental agencies, they may not be equipped with the ability to establish or to generate those science. And this is really where partnerships either with academia or even with the private sector comes in to play very significantly. Because only through such partnerships will there be the right evidence to decide should a sugar tax be applicable in this particular setting. Would a tobacco tax or a sin tax be relevant to help government raise revenues, and how should this be spent or be accumulated in the government coffers or to ring-fence it for health promotion? Many of these decisions, be it in health promotion, be it around sexual health matters, around pandemic control, many of this actually academia holds the authority and the ability to conduct very rigorous research during peacetime, and that partnership that is established during peacetime becomes immensely valuable during a crisis moment. And we see from COVID-19 that some of the experiences that we've seen worldwide, whether it is in South Korea, whether it is in Singapore, in China, in New Zealand, the very top respondent countries, it's because the government interact very closely with partners on the ground, be it academia, be it community welfare groups, such that they get the necessary evidence and information to make the necessary policy. And I see this to be equally important during peacetime as is during crisis time. Over back to you.
Thank you, Professor Chiu. Does anyone else want to respond?
Well, I think as an academic, I agree with Dean here, but at the same time, I think the government policy, including health policy, should be based on evidence, but at the same time, there are some like a value judgment aspect, I think. So you're right, at the very first moment, at the initial phase of the rapid dissemination or rapid infection phase of like the pandemic of COVID-19, we should really, it's like an emergency crisis situation. So we should make a very swift decision making based on academic evidence. But at some point of time, our decision is that to what extent, what's the level of risk as a society are we willing to take? Because we cannot make this, risk of infection, we cannot make it zero. Okay? So at a certain point, we should make a value judgment decisions as well, based on evidence. Because our goal is not the minimization of risk, but in a sense, we should make a social consensus on what is the optimum level of social risk as a society are willing to take. Like whether we should open the school at what time. It's not just a medical decision. It's like a profound impact on the caregiving, okay, or women's labor participation. So in that case, the decision making should go beyond the medical or healthcare sector decision making. Rather, it's more like a social economic decision, like whether we should open at some point. We should open if we have a severe lockdown, we should lift up, because from a medical perspective, lockdown is the answer. But at a certain point, we should not overkill the economy or society, livelihood. So all those decisions, I'm sure the first most important part is the evidence from a medical health perspective, but at the same time, we should take into account the value judgment of the society or consensus.
If I added 2 points, and I'd like to say that although that there's many lessons, also experience we've been sharing around the world, but at the bottom line is we still do not know much about this virus. And Korea is, I think it's one of the first country experienced a spike of coronavirus in the mid-February. We're the first country to flatten the curve, and we're the first country hold a nationwide general election in April, and we are the one of the countries start playing baseball again. But when it comes to the evidence and also scientific finding, there are still much we do not know than we do know about this virus. So I think although that we should base it on our decision on the scientific finding, but we do not have time to get all the answer in the scientific way. And second one is it is really the testing time for all government, not only for each government but all sector, not only the health and quarantine business, also the business for the economic sector, schools, and also the airliners, and everywhere they need to answer this COVID-19 question. And even the international cooperation will be very pivotal. And my routine job is developing and financing and doing with World Bank, and they have facing extremely difficulty in conducting their daily operation and back to normal. So I think it's one point we should say is everybody leave what they're saying and practicing and taking is an important footstep. And these footsteps are the important lesson and should be continually promoted and also to share with across the border.
Okay, thank you very much for those insightful responses. I think there's some discussion here about the role of science and evidence and also the role of politics. And to me, as a social scientist, I think it's immensely relevant that the crisis, the pandemic reached South Korea a few years after a political crisis that ended up building tremendous trust among ordinary people in the government and in the ability of ordinary people to make the government work for it. And that is probably something we should think about as we understand the response in that country. I'd like to turn now to some of the questions that we have from our audience that have been following on the internet. So Let me start. So we'll go back to Professor Guan. We have a question. How has Seoul coordinated with local governments in responding to the pandemic?
It's a good question because in ordinary times, it is the local government responsibility to take care of this infectious disease. For example, there's a public health centers in each localities, and the public health centers is under the local government. But in case of this type of severe infectious disease, in Korea we have 4 different levels of infectious disease, and this like a COVID-19 is listed as a level 1 most serious disease. So in this case, central government, especially the Korean KCDC, can take the technical lead in the epidemiological research, epidemiological investigation. But in most cases, so the local government and collaborate very closely with the KCDC in terms of epidemiological investigation. And also another important area of collaboration is like in Korea, in the Daegu, Gyeongbuk area, there is a surge of a spike of patients in that area. So there is a shortage of patients. And then there should be a intergovernment or inter-province coordination such that the patient from that area, region, are transported in the other provinces. So that is another very important part of the collaboration among localities. And also, this COVID-19 is a new disease, so there are a lot of uncertainty in terms of what is the best treatment method and what is the patient triage. And all those technical aspects are provided by central government, KCDC, and then local government follow those technical lead and patient triage, things like that, to give just a few examples.
Okay, thank you. So in Korea, we have a decentralized system of government, and it's that the local governments usually take care of these public health issues. But in this time, we have a lot more guidance coming from Seoul.
Central,
that's what we're hearing here. Excellent. Okay, the next question from our audience. We have a question, this can go to any speaker, a question about homelessness, where we have people in society who are homeless and who may be vulnerable to getting ill from the virus. Can anyone speak to particular measures that are taken either to detect or prevent disease in that population? No responses on this?
It's a very good question, but I don't have I don't have answer. Sorry.
Okay, maybe this is for another panel. Let me move to the next question then. The next question.
Actually, if no one is addressing it, I will take that question because I
Thanks,
thought,
Dean Chiao.
Yeah, I wanted to. So in Singapore, yes, we do have homeless people in Singapore, and when we have our version of a partial lockdown, which is called a circuit breaker. And during this period, it was a 2-month period, about 8 weeks. What the government did was actually it opened up shelters in various parts of Singapore to actually allow homeless to come in. And there were about 700 government spaces that were made available, or rather I should phrase it the other way, there were government spaces that were made available for 700 people to come in. And in fact, that number turned out to be a rather fortunate overestimate because only about 250 of the beds were taken up. But in addition to this shelters, which are called safe, sound sleeping places for homeless people, there were also partnering organizations with the VWOs, the voluntary welfare organizations, to look after the vulnerable and the homeless in the society. So in times like this, what we have seen, as what Dr. Leong have mentioned, we are very proud that there is a segment within Singapore that were very generous in lending out aid to people who may be less able to provide for themselves or to provide for their families. So this extends to the homeless as well. And in fact, in Singapore, we have a specific ministry that is called the Ministry for Social and Family Development, whose mandate is precisely to look after the more vulnerable people in society. Over back to you, Professor Mowbray.
All right, thanks very much, Dean Teo. Sticking with Singapore, vulnerable groups, we have another question from our audience. It was mentioned by both Dean Teo and Dr. Leong that the dormitories for the foreign workers in Singapore were places where the virus spread rapidly. So the question we have from the audience member is there some consideration within government or among health policy specialists to consider recommending changes to the dormitory system?
I'll just give it a shot at this. Definitely. I think this is the entire foreign worker fiasco and the huge numbers and the outbreak is a step back on our own people, how we have been treating the foreign workers and the circumstances in which they have been living. Embarrassingly, foreign workers are kept in a separate place and location from the other people. We have a term called NIMBY in Singapore, which means not in my backyard syndrome. So we don't like some of these inconveniences to be inside at the backyard near our homes and places. But this has to change. I think this COVID-19, if anything, is a good wake-up call for Singapore, Singaporeans, the government, and even the people who actually run the dormitories, that things have to change. Okay, we have to adopt a more open and understanding. We have to appreciate who the foreign workers are and actually accord them a lot more better benefits. Indeed, the previous requirement that each foreign worker be given about 2 square meters of space, okay, has been increased to 4 square meters of space overnight. And this, if I'm not wrong, it was 2 to 4 or 4 to 6, but there was a significant increase. And this happened overnight to the extent that dormitory workers are screaming foul. How could you make such a sudden change so quickly? And I can't get my workers in place. So, but this tells you that from the hearts of the Singaporeans, to the heart of the government, there's a recognized need that things have to change, and it starts now. So going forward, we do hope that the foreign workers do not become a vulnerable group in getting infections. We have had cases of pertussis outbreaks and measles outbreak in the foreign worker dormitories. We hope all this will come to an end. Could actually better healthcare be available to them, not just from their own pockets, not just from the business and the companies they run for, but they work for, but as well as from the government and from the society as a whole. So things will change. I guess to the person who's asking this question, I can only say watch this space. In times to come, we're going to see what happens. And I, like many other Singaporeans, would like to see a massive change in this policy.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Leong. I'll move right along to our next question. This is for Professor Guan. The question is, what has been the role of, if any, of the national security agencies in South Korea in responding to the virus?
So national security means like a political level.
Intelligence agency, perhaps?
Well, as far,
or military?
Yeah, but as far as I know, there is no significant role of that security. Of course, there is some role of the law enforcement because, yeah, law agency is there. But I think in terms of national security, I might be wrong. I'm not sure. But as far as I know, we didn't have many opportunities to talk about or mention the role of national security. But Director Lee, correct me if I'm wrong.
If I redefine the definition of national security, and when you say the intelligence, and even if they're having operation, I shouldn't have any knowledge about their operation. But when you focusing on the national security in the military and the men in service in uniform, I think the Korean Ministry of Defense also played a very important role, because I've been receiving a lot of questions from the overseas, because there is a need for a lot of manpower and support in the disinfection, quarantine, contact tracing, and also there is a high demand or manpower in the airport or port of entry, and we cannot hire them overnight. And the men in uniform and servicemen has been very active and providing their service, and they're well trained, and also they also help to quarantine the schools and the vulnerable facility, because we cannot get all the enough hands through the local government and so on. And also another very touching story is there is a military academy for the doctors and nurses, and they are supposed to graduate in the early March, but we saw the outbreak in February, so they skipped their graduation and commencement, and they sent their medical staff right into the field even before the graduation. So I think it's another important and hero, unsung hero of this COVID-19 response in Korea. Is also we should express great gratitude for the military personnel.
Okay, great. Thank you for those responses. So we have audience members who are watching our event from all different parts of the world. And of course, many of us are trying to learn from the experiences of governments in different places and trying to understand what is being done, what is working, and what is not working. And there's a question of to what extent is it really possible to learn from another country's experience when the conditions may be so different. So this is my preface to a question from one of our audience members. And that question is, are there any lessons from either Singapore or South Korea that could be applicable to India? Perhaps I could invite one of our speakers either to think specifically of India, otherwise to think about what are the possible limits to the lessons that have been learned either in Singapore or South Korea. That is, are the things that have gone right or wrong, are they things that we think are specific to this particular context and country, given the social environment or given the public health system? Or are some of the lessons ones that are nearly universal?
I think one of the issues we have in answering this question is, I don't think neither any of four of us are very familiar with how India and the healthcare system works there. But certainly, we can. There are many things that are very similar between Singapore and India. We have metropolitan cities, and people live very close to another. And there's a lot of Asian values that are shared between both countries. And unfortunately, all the things which are very Asian, a lot of things which are that brings us together, will unfortunately spread the infection. And it doesn't help that India is very diverse, and you have workers and people coming from different states coming back. Indeed, it will create the same scenario of when the people return back to their homes, as we learned recently, the virus will be disseminated exactly the same way. And when people live close together, the virus will spread. One thing which I want to just reinforce to my Indian friends would be that the virus is really very different from what we've seen. They spread very, very easily. And one of the things that really caught Singapore unaware was the asymptomatic and the pre-symptomatic spread. Something which the Chinese told the WHO inspection group that they didn't really quite was a problem. But in truth, it was a major, major problem in Singapore. There were many asymptomatic spread cases, and that created the scenario which we have now. So going back to India, the lesson to learn is you can't tell who has a virus, who doesn't have a virus. Unless you do a PCR, unless you start doing testing, you won't see it. And if you don't look for them, you don't think of them, the virus will infiltrate into the hospitals, as a pneumonia, as a fever or something else, and in turn it can spread on to many other individuals in the hospital. In other words, your hospital can be a focus of infection. Number two, the healthcare workers are your most precious resource. You have to protect them, and protection in terms of PPE, personal protective equipment, is very important. It's very crucial that each healthcare worker feels comfortable and knows that he's protected, not only against the virus, but against the backlash that may come as healthcare workers work in the environment. Healthcare workers do become sick, do become tired, and you need to encourage them, because if they fail, your whole healthcare system will fail and your whole country will fail. I'll pass the mic to the next person.
So thank you very much, Dr. Leong. Professor Mo Brand, YY here. So I thought I will follow on from what Dr. Leong had mentioned. India, we have to look at the health system in India. The health system in India is not a federal system. It is actually a state-controlled system. And what that means is that actually, when we talk about India as a country, the situation for COVID-19 in India, it's vastly different depending on which state you're talking about. For example, Kerala has a fantastic outcome. They have put in place very, very good public health measures, whole of government approaches, very similar to what Dr. Leong has outlined earlier on in the state of Kerala. And you could see that in the outbreak in Kerala. Compared to some of the other states in different parts of India, you would notice that there is a significant difference between the outcome in the best performing state and some of the states that are currently still struggling, including Delhi, Gujarat, Maharashtra. Now, when we look at what Kerala did right, this is really where it comes back down to how fast the government, the leadership of the state government was able to put in place certain measures, some of it very difficult measures. For example, Kerala implemented a lockdown much earlier than any national plans for a lockdown. They put in place very aggressive contact tracing, and that contact tracing was not just a government effort. They actually roped in community efforts as well. There was a community surveillance system that was able to be mobilized very quickly to perform the contact tracing. So some of the principles that we've talked about by all four speakers of what worked in South Korea, what worked well in Singapore, such as contact tracing, very rapidly identifying who are the people that have been exposed. You isolate these people very quickly. Those are measures that, in my opinion, it's independent of the resources that governments have or do not have. And those, you can mobilize the community to very quickly perform this contact tracing. And I see that this question around India, we need to understand some of the health system barriers, including the financing of the health system as well, and the diversity that they have between the states. So I wouldn't presume that we have lessons in Singapore, perhaps or South Korea, that can extend to India, because I do believe that within India itself, there are already very good lessons that you can copy from, such as from Kerala. Over back to you, Professor Mo Brand.
All right, thanks very much, Dean Chiu, for the response. Yeah, is that Professor Guan? Yes, please.
I can have a short comments, not exclusively on India, but these days a lot of discussions on the pros and cons or trade-off of saving lives and saving livelihood, especially in the context of low and middle income countries. Because in high-income countries, it's right that maybe lockdown is a good response to the pandemic. But in the context of low and middle income countries, complete lockdown across the board may have a much worse socioeconomic consequences compared to high-income countries. So, like, for example, the population structure, age structure of low and middle income countries is slightly different from the high income countries. So instead of a complete lockdown, probably a lockdown, shorter lockdown and lockdown targeted the vulnerable population like older people and people with existing conditions might be more reasonable solution. For example, these days there are some research outcomes showing that the mortality in many low and middle income countries, excess mortality from non-COVID-19 patients is almost equal or becoming higher than the mortality of COVID-19 patients. So because of the lockdown, or even if it is not a lockdown, but if there is a very high level of restrictions, then many people suffer. It's not just a livelihood or economy, but people with other disease, like non-COVID conditions, they cannot use healthcare, and there's a huge mortality, increasing amount of mortality from non-COVID situations. So probably this trade, we call it trade-off, this saving lives and saving livelihood, can be different between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. In that sense, across the board, complete lockdown, we should think twice in the context of low and middle-income countries. Over.
If I added just a very quick comment, and I received a very similar question 2 weeks ago when we have a dialogue with the UK, and we're talking about the experience of Korea, and some of the lessons can be applied for the UK, which have a very high level of a casualty and death rate right now. And the answer was even for the UK, which is a birthplace of public health system, and also the National Health Service, they cannot follow exactly same as what Korea did it in UK, and nobody can follow what Korea did it and what Singapore did it in the same context. But there are some very important lessons we could share. One is very quick, agile, and speed response of government. And because this virus, unlike other, is traveled very quickly and very silently. So it's important for the policymaker, health quarantine official respond quickly. And number two is, although there has been no scientific confirming data, but recently the World Health Organization recommend using of a face mask will be very important to reduce the risk. So face mask will be very important tool to fight the COVID-19. And third one is, although that you may not have the same level of a healthcare system and the hospital access, you need to reorganize your hospital to treat those intensive case and to treat the mild case, and also to treat the infectious disease and regular disease. So I think this is another important things all countries can be adopted in accordingly to their systems and condition.
Okay, thank you very much to each of our speakers for these comments, which help us to put the lessons of both Singapore and South Korea in a broader worldwide context. We are really running out of time here, so I think we should leave that as our last question. I want to both apologize to our viewers whose questions I could not pose to our speakers, and also thank the audience for their tremendous interest in this event and in the presentations. We do have a great many questions, and because we've had such high quality presentations. So thank you to the audience for the high level of engagement in today's event. Thank you to our speakers for the crisp, sharp, clear presentations. I have learned a great deal today about this specific topic of public-private partnerships in fighting the coronavirus, and also in the responses and challenges we've had in Singapore and South Korea. If any of our speakers would like to have a final word, I'll give you 10 seconds if you'd like to. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your participation. One last message here is to note that the Korea Foundation's Virtual Dialogue series, in this series we have the 6th and final dialogue session occurring on the 17th of June at 5 p.m. Korea time, and this is with colleagues in Sweden. All right, so the 6th and final Korea Foundation Virtual Dialogue session, June 17th at 5 p.m. Korea time. Now I'd like to just say thank you again to the audience and to our speakers, and this concludes our Korea Foundation, Singapore International Foundation Virtual Dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.